Louise Waddell's life was nothing. Her marriage to a member of the imperial family was only the beginning. Unfortunately, after 5 years of marriage, she was banished to a secluded palace by the emperor because her husband had taken a mistress and brought her to the palace. The girl killed herself by working without rest. Eventually, Louise ended her life tragically. The protagonist who narrated this entertaining story woke up in the body of the tragic heroine of the novel. The girl in Louise's body sat on the bed and couldn't believe it wasn't all a dream. Of all the possible stories, she woke up to the saddest one, the one that would make you choke on your tears. While the girl was being brushed by the maid, she kept thinking about the disaster that had befallen her. Besides, today was a very special day. The day Louise Waddell spoke out to the emperor as empress for the first time in her life. To this day, Louise was to live in a secluded palace, where not a single ray of light penetrated, and work herself to death. However, the girl refused to die so lowly. In her previous life, she had no relationships because she was busy, but in this life, she had no intention of working so hard. Louise came to see her husband, the emperor, Yuri Klaus Owen. The man was sitting and having fun with his mistress. She turned at the sound and spotted the empress, which she decided to inform the emperor of. His mistress had blonde hair and green eyes. Her name was Lady Lyra Blair. The main character recognized what this Lyra looked like and noticed that the girl was very beautiful. The man asked what brought his wife to the main palace. He didn't even try to hide that he wasn't even happy about his wife's appearance, and neither was everyone else in the hall. Louisa, who was not yet of age, had no power, so she could not hope for a throne, let alone an heir. Lyra, his mistress, must become pregnant and become his lawful wedded wife immediately after Louisa's coming-of-age ceremony, 3 months later. The protagonist decided that if she didn't want to work herself to death, this was her only chance. She asked her husband if he remembered what promise he had made to her. Louise reminded him that he had said that if she solved the economy, he would grant her one wish. The crowd began to whisper. Everyone remembered that they had discussed it at the council meeting 6 months ago. The emperor had agreed with the girl. They simply couldn't forget, because the currency issue was a long-standing problem of the empire. Louise had managed to solve it in a short period of time. The protagonist smiled happily and replied that she knew he remembered the promise. Yuri glumly said that he had promised to fulfill one wish of hers if his wife solved the currency issue within 6 months, and irritably asked her that she had come to pester him with her wish. The girl stood in a huge hall in front of her husband's throne, on which he sat himself, and next to him his mistress. Everyone in the hall stood and listened to their conversation. The girl replied that she had come to say her wish. Yuri grinned and promised to listen to her and asked her what she wanted. Lyra shuddered, immediately flustered at such news. She was cautiously waiting to see what the empress's wish was. Probably everyone thought that Louise would take this opportunity to get rid of the emperor's mistress. But unfortunately, they were all wrong. The girl did not want the honor of being empress, and did not need the love of the emperor. The protagonist voiced her desire. She wanted her husband to overthrow her. The man stared at her in shock. Louise repeated that she wanted to abdicate. Yuri shouted if she was in her right mind. The girl replied with a smile that she was in her right mind, and asked him if he would keep his promise. The people in the audience began to get indignant. The man with the mustache shouted that the empress could not ask for abdication. Louise turned to him and replied that it would be the first time in history. The man excitedly asked why she was asking for it so suddenly. The protagonist nonchalantly replied that she had been thinking about it for a long time. She didn't want to put up with it all anymore, so she was asking to be overthrown. The girl had been thinking about it since the 3rd day she woke up in this world. The first point of her plan was to avoid death and live a long and happy life, renouncing the title of empress. She thought that being an empress was like being a free laborer. She didn't understand why she had to do it all for free. The man with the mustache could not get behind the girl and asked her that if she abdicated, who would oversee all the affairs of state. It was as if Louise had been reminded of the most important thing of all, and with an important index finger raised upwards, she appealed to the emperor that after the divorce, she should be able to provide for herself. For Louise's family had never been mentioned once in the whole story. There was only one reason why they might not answer her letters. Most likely the family had given up on the girl because she couldn't get the emperor's favor. So if she divorced without any plan, she would just starve to death. And so the girl came up with the idea and expressed her desire to work at the palace officially. Yuri couldn't believe his ears. Louise repeated to him that she wanted to become his lady-in-waiting instead of the empress. The man got even more angry and jumped up and shouted at his wife whether she could hear herself at all. The girl stood her ground and calmly said that from now on he would have to pay her, if, of course, he wanted her to work. That wasn't all. The protagonist wanted overtime, paid vacation, severance pay, and even a pension. The girl was determined to get all her wishes. Louise woke up after a great night's sleep. She hadn't had such an invigorating morning in a long time. Her memories were becoming more and more vivid, but she thought that if she let her guard down, she risked forgetting her own. The main character was being brushed by the maids, and she said out loud that she was only a civil servant in the past. 3 maids behind the girl stood and looked at her incomprehensibly. One of them didn't hear anything and asked again. The second one could hear only the first word and asked her mistress what it meant. Louise explained to them that it meant a civil servant, or rather she was a tax inspector, and explained that this was the person who dealt with taxes. The girls immediately brightened up when they heard the familiar word. The girl thought with a smile that probably taxes were everywhere. The main character recalled her past life as she served disgruntled customers who rushed her, called her names, and treated her disrespectfully. Life was hard, but there were just as many positives. Once her colleague recommended one book, where everything was just terrible. All the events in the novel happened too sad. The girl could not read it anymore, put it aside, and went to bed. And when she opened her eyes, she found herself in this terrible place in the body of the poor heroine. This story she told to her maids. The girls listened to it. An awkward silence hung. But the next second, 2 of them, merrily covering their mouths with their hands, exclaimed joyfully that it all sounded marvelous. Another said that her introduction sounded refreshing, and that waking up in another world was so interesting and exciting. The girls were delighted with their mistress's idea. It would never have occurred to them. Louise sat and smiled strainedly. After all, she had decided to mention it just to see if there was such a case here. What girl suddenly flew into the room, informing Her Majesty that they had a problem? Louise turned around, startled, and stared at the girl. The protagonist went outside. In front of her stood a crowd of noblemen. They were excitedly calling out to her. The men asked her to talk to them because they had a lot of unfinished work and asked her not to abandon her duties. They were in a panic because all the work in the palace was standing. The girl was surprised that the men had made such a mess just for the day of her strike. Louise asked in surprise that really she was responsible for such a huge amount of work. The girl beside her leaned over to her and told her that, in fact, more than half of it all had to be handled by the ministers. This work was not within the Empress's authority. Louise now realized why the girl had so much work to do. She was not only doing her job, but also those that the incompetent emperor and nobles had to do. The main character of the table pondered while the nobles argued with each other, deciding who would be the first to ask the Empress for help. The girl stood looking at the insolent ministers. She said aloud that it was no wonder Louise was working herself to death. The protagonist threw her hands up and said that at this rate she would die of work and categorically said that she would not do all this. At this, she gave orders to the guards to close the gate. The guards looked at her worriedly, not believing their eyes that the Empress had ordered something to him. The men began to cry out in tears that she could not do this to them and asked her not to leave her. Louise, leaving, angrily replied that she had not abandoned anyone. It was they who had abandoned her because they had all shamelessly used her. The men did not stop and shouted in the girl's back to help them with anything. When they saw that the girl did not react to them in any way, they threatened her through the bars that they would resort to extreme measures. Louise was sitting at a table in a beautiful gazebo. 2 servants stood beside her in front of her, bowed and greeted by a man with long blonde hair tied in a ponytail. It was the Chancellor of the Owen Empire, Ruel Filbert. She asked the protagonist to call off her strike. The men were not wrong in saying that Ruel was their last resort. Ruel Filbert was the top leader in charge of state affairs. He was also the youngest chancellor of the Owen Empire. Ruel was the second son of Marquis Filbert. He was called a genius from childhood, so the previous emperor hired him as soon as he graduated from the academy. But as the protagonist remembered, the man did not socialize with Louise. Ruel came to ask her to call off the strike and wondered how she managed to hold back all the time. The girl didn't understand what he meant. The man explained to her that he was talking about all the work she was doing. Louise had a rather soft character, so everyone was shocked by her antics. Louise, spreading her hands, replied that she was only trying to do her best to get the emperor to notice her, but it was useless. The girl realized that it couldn't go on like this any longer. Ruel, covering his eyes, asked the girl to forget the affairs of state for now, because what was happening outside the walls was more important. He handed her the form and told her to take a look at it. The protagonist, revealing it, asked what it was. The man explained that it was gossip about her. Louise was surprised that they even had such a thing. She felt sorry for poor Louise because she didn't even realize how many interesting things there were around her. The girl stopped at one page and looked at it in surprise. The man realized what was written there and confirmed that she had gotten it right. It was on this particular spread that was written about the scandal of the century, the shocking news of how the empress had demanded a divorce. People suspected that the main reason was the emperor's infidelity, for his mistress was none other than the famous Owen's flower, Lady Lyra Blair. Ruel asked the girl worriedly if she now realized how serious the situation was. Louise agreed with that. The situation was indeed serious. The man asked, relieved that she finally understood how he felt. The protagonist ignored his question and asked that wasn't she prettier than her. Ruel was shocked. The girl, scratching her chin, thought aloud that she was the only one who thought so, because it was obvious that she was prettier, and asked the man if he agreed. Turning the catalog to him and showing him her and Lyra's portraits, asked him who he thought was prettier. The young man pounded his fists irritably on the table and shouted, "Did it matter now?" But the girl really didn't understand. Looking at their images, Louise was sure they were both beautiful. The main character saw herself as a kitty and Lear as a rabbit, and thought that cats were more attractive than rabbits. She asked Ruel if he was the answer to her or not, and generally suggested that maybe he wasn't interested in women. The man jumped up and blurted out that they were both not his type. Louise decided to make sure he was single. Ruel confirmed it and asked what it had to do with it. The girl confessed to him that she knew it. The latest news of Empress Louise challenging Owen's flower was being discussed everywhere. According to an anonymous source, the Empress insulted the looks of her rival Lady Lyra Blair and called herself a true beauty. Louise was lying on the sofa eating cookies, reading the latest gossip. She decided that there were spies in the palace because she had said something similar, but they had distorted it badly. It was the second day of the strike. The magazine was wondering if the Empress would be able to successfully divorce the Emperor. Louise read it all and was displeased at how people liked to poke around in other people's laundry. She was also upset by the fact that they were all sure she would not be able to get a divorce. The girl jumped up. She had a catalog and a pillow on the floor. She didn't think it would be easy either. She got up and walked to the table, pushing back her chair. She thought that this was not going to work, and she needed to think of a clear plan. And first, she needed to remember everything that would happen in the future. First of all, she's supposed to get a divorce within this month. The prophecy is about to be fulfilled. The Emperor married Louise because of her family. Although the Vidal family was rarely involved in foreign affairs because they had no interest in politics, it was rumored that all of their hidden wealth exceeded that of the imperial family, mostly due to the Philiadet mine, which was located in the southern part of Vidal's domain. Every year, elemental crystals were mined here. These were minerals imbued with the power of the elements and allowed the use of magic. Only the Vidal family could awaken elemental crystals. It made the mine impossible for the imperial family to capture. But one day, a girl was born in the Vidal family, in which for a long time, only boys were born. And it was the main character, Louise Waddell. Upon hearing such news, the previous emperor immediately demanded a marriage between the houses of Vidal and the imperial family. Their goal was to produce an heir with Louise's blood, but a problem suddenly arose. Blinded by love, the emperor decided to get rid of Louise. He wanted to put his plan into action a few days ago at a feast, but at that moment, a prophecy sounded in the temple. The prophecy was, "The daughter of the Red Iris will bring peace and prosperity to the empire, and the one who possesses her will become the lord of the continent." The Red Iris is the symbol of the House of Waddell. In other words, the daughter of Red Iris was Louise Waddell. Every nation, not just the Owen Empire, aspired to become the lord of the entire continent. After hearing the prophecy, the emperor's mother, fearing that Owen might lose Louise, ordered the soldiers to keep an eye on her. So now the girl was being closely monitored. She sat and wrote a to-do list, wondering painfully why she had been reborn into such a complicated character. Her to-do list included: get a divorce, prevent a prophecy, work less, earn more to live a comfortable life. She read the list and calculated that there was enough to do for now. Right now, she was prioritizing the first and second items, because even if she divorced, the prophecy would still come true, because there was no way the imperial family would give up the main key to conquering the entire continent. Louise would be in big trouble if other countries came into play, so she preferred to avoid it. To her, it sounded better to live as Mistress Waddell than as an empress with eternal restrictions. The Waddell family had plenty of money, so the girl had nothing to worry about. But to do that, she would have to decide what to do with the other Waddellas. The girl was abruptly rushed in by her assistant. Louise, stretching, asked what had happened this time. The girl with the red bow in her hair replied that the emperor had summoned her to his central palace immediately. Louise was all brightened up and thought happily that the day had finally arrived. As the girl walked down the corridor towards the emperor, thinking that he somehow thought for a long time before calling her, she suspected that he was up to something. The girl was tired of thinking about it and decided that she would get the main answer today. Louise met Lyra near the emperor's door. The girl had the nerve to ask the empress what brought her here and stared stupidly at the emperor's wife. Louise replied to her that the emperor wanted to see her. The protagonist was surprised that Lyra was allowed to enter his office. In any case, the nobles would be outraged if they knew that a mistress was allowed to enter the emperor's office. The girl bowed and said that the emperor was busy with affairs of state, so he asked not to be disturbed. Louise asked the girl what she thought his wife would be disturbing him. Lyra, frightened, started to say that she didn't mean that, but she couldn't explain and cried. The empress's aide explained to Lady Lyra that Louise was here at the emperor's invitation. The mistress raised her eyes to her, covered her mouth with her hand, asked if she was sure, for as she thought it could not be, she suddenly sighed fearfully, as if she had said too much. Louise, mocking the girl, told her that according to rumors, she was a good person, but, in her opinion, Lyra was a wolf in sheep's clothing. But it didn't matter because the protagonist was not going to linger here anyway. She had no time for these games. So the empress asked her husband's mistress to step aside. Lyra resented that Louise thought the green-eyed girl was playing a game and admitted that she had always wanted to be friends with her. But she, the girl, didn't finish. She was interrupted by Louise asking what she had done. After all, she never bullied her, never asked her to stay away from her husband, and never turned the nobles against Lyra. When she didn't hear a clear answer from her mistress, the protagonist irritably complained that communicating with a person who couldn't listen was tiring her, so she asked her assistant Rhonda to return. Rhonda looked at her in surprise. The empress turned away from Lyra and asked her to tell the emperor that if he had anything to say from now on, let him write to her instead of making her drag herself to him. Menacing footsteps sounded, and the next second, the door to the emperor's office opened. A disgruntled Yuri appeared on the threshold, looking at Lyra. He asked what the noise was going on in the corridor. The mistress, not ashamed of anything, threw herself into the man's arms. Yuri stared at her in surprise, asking her what she was doing near his office. Snotty apologies began, that she didn't want to intrude, and looked at the empress in tears, waiting for her excuses. Louise noted that the girl was not a bad actress. She bowed to the emperor and apologized, explaining that she was just about to leave. But Yuri grabbed the girl's hand, asking where she was going, because he had told the assistant that he wanted to talk to her. Lyra, holding the young man's hand, looked at him in surprise. The protagonist perplexedly arched an eyebrow and said that was why she was here, but she was told he was busy, so was about to leave already. The man interrupted her, pulling her by the arm, telling her he wasn't busy and asking her to follow him. He turned to Lyra, stroked her cheek and asked her to wait for him at his place. The girl was in tears, wanting to say something else, but she wasn't allowed to. Yuri took his wife into his office and put her on a chair. He himself sat in a neighboring chair, asking her if she was feeling well. The girl didn't understand what he wanted. He asked her if she was still playing dumb because, in his opinion, his wife had arranged everything for his attention. Because the world revolves around him. Louise grinned in shock at the man's self-assurance. He hunched over his legs and began to justify himself, saying that he knew it was a mistake to bring Lyra without telling her. He should have consulted his wife. Yuri assured her that he regretted it, but he had his reasons. He began to tell the tearful and snotty story of poor and unfortunate Lyra. Her Blair family was in dire straits. They were on the verge of ruin. The family had dispersed to other estates. Lyra and her younger brother and sister were forced to move from one relative to another forever. Yuri felt sorry for such a poor sheep. Lyra, apparently the Empire is an orphanage for the poor, and he could take in anyone out of pity. The man assured her that he wasn't thinking of putting Lyra in Louise's place, but the protagonist interrupted his ramblings, saying that she didn't want to hear it, because she didn't care what he thought about her. Yuri, like a fool, looked up at her and began to continue his crazy speech again, that Lyra has a good heart, and he believed that they will get along, because Louise was alone in the family, and therefore advised her to treat her as an older sister. Cool man came up with nothing to say. He even promised to talk to Lyra and asked her to let go of all her resentments and return to her duties. The Empress interrupted him again, telling him to cut the crap and just agree to the divorce. Yuri looked at her worriedly and asked if she was serious now. Louise queried him in response. She really did look like she was joking around. The man spoke differently then, saying what would happen if he didn't allow it. The girl then turned away from him, exhaling, saying that he was leaving her no choice, and after all she wanted so badly to make the best of it. The Emperor asked excitedly what she wanted. Louise cheerfully declared that then she too would have a lover, and smilingly admitted to her husband that he was not her type. Ruel, when he heard this, abruptly jumped up from his seat and asked the girl what she was just thinking, and asked that she was completely out of her mind. Louise sat calmly sipping her tea and replied that she was completely serious. The man leaned over the table and began to beg the Empress to think of something else. The protagonist nonchalantly replied that it was the only way. Then Ruel decided to scare Louise, saying that it could affect her reputation. The girl understood this, but asked him what he thought it would seriously tarnish her honor somehow. The Empress brings different men to her every night. Such a topic for gossip would definitely be a hot topic. Ruel guessed that the girl wanted to see if he would divorce her, even if it would somehow affect the reputation of the imperial family. Yuri was not going to divorce his wife, so Louise had only one option left, to be expelled in disgrace. The protagonist raised her index finger importantly, reminding the Chancellor that such cases had happened here before. One empress fell in love with her knight, for which she was banished in disgrace, so the girl reassured Ruel that she would not disgrace herself alone. The man would not be relentless and no longer knew what to do to get the Empress to listen to him. He begged her pitifully. Louise asked Ruel to calm down because he already looked exhausted, so she asked him to have some tea. The man noticed a gossip magazine on the table, pulled it over to him and asked, surprised, that the Empress was still reading this nonsense, taking it in his hands and opening it, saying that if she had time for this nonsense, she had somewhere to look, but he didn't say where because he saw the news that shocked him. He came across a questionnaire left by the Empress. The girl wrote that she was looking for a life partner, named her place of residence, and explained that she was tired of the Emperor's indifference, so she was looking for a lover. In the script, she wrote that she favors one lovers. Louise, scratching the back of her head, showed him the class. The man shouted for her to kill him. The girl put her hands forward for him to stop and calm down. Rule asked the protagonist to immediately order the article to be reissued with edits. But Louise replied that it was already too late, because it was probably already sent out all over the continent. The man was at a loss for words. The girl calmed him down, saying what's done is done. The Chancellor covered his face with his hand, saying that if the first prince had been here, the empire would not be in this state. The Empress was surprised and recalled seeing him once. The missing first prince was Regan Klaus Owen, a kid with blonde hair and violet eyes. He was the rightful heir, the son of the previous emperor and empress. But one accident led to Yuri Klaus Owen being the one to become emperor. Regan was only mentioned once in the book and never appeared again. Louise asked the Chancellor how the first prince had disappeared. Rule said that the previous emperor had health problems that caused him to go to another country for treatment, and when the first prince decided to visit the emperor, the carriage fell off a cliff on the way, and all the attendants were found dead. The investigation revealed that they were attacked, but the body of the first prince was never found. So Rule said that many believe he is alive. It was also said that one day he would return to stand at the head of the crumbling empire and the imperial family. The girl suggested that the first prince must have been a distinguished man, but Ruel grimaced at the thought and said flatly that he was not. Louise stared at him in surprise. The man explained that, frankly speaking, the prince was even more stubborn than the current emperor. He was nicknamed Lightning, and not without reason, because Rule admitted he'd never met a more narcissistic man. But Regan was universally respected, and the people had high hopes for him. The man also believed that one day he would return and put an end to all the imperial chaos. Louise asked him if she too was part of this chaos. The Chancellor thought she belonged to the chaos and pounded the table with his fist and asked what she was thinking and what he should do now with all she had done. But the girl replied that she didn't think he needed to interfere at all because she was serious. The man looked at her worriedly. Louise said dreamily that maybe this was her chance to find her destiny. In the village located in the north of the empire, Zenoa, the dark sky was illuminated by flashes of crooked lightning. Lights were burning everywhere in the houses. Inside one establishment, two men sat at a table and talked. One was asking how many days had passed and what they were going to do if something happened. The other answered him rudely to stop his superstitious nonsense. But the man with the beard said that it was strange that there were so many lightning bolts and no fire. The man, on the contrary, supposed that it was the wrath of God, because God knows what was going on in the empire. The bell tied to the front door of the tavern jingled, and a man in a cloak with a hood on his head came in. The traveler told the waitress that he would like to stay the night and asked if they had a spare room. The girl cheerfully said there would be, but first she offered him something to eat. The stranger sat down at the table. The girl brought him a beer. The man was surprised that it was not yet dark outside, and the inn was already so crowded. The woman replied that everyone was surprised at what was happening in the empire, and leaned closer to the man, whispered that according to rumors, the imperial family was in complete confusion. The traveler, bringing his mug of beer to his lips, pronounced that their half-witted emperor was in trouble again. The waitress jumped up and told him that he was not following the rumors. The man turned to her questioningly. The girl explained that everyone was discussing the emperor's divorce, and in addition, the empress announced that she was looking for a lover. She gave him the newspaper, pointing with her finger to the right page, where the empress's announcement was written. The stranger looked at it and tilted his head back and laughed out loud. He looked at the image of Louise and said that this child was obviously preparing something interesting for them. The man got up from the bench and, apologizing, told the waitress that he had just now remembered that he had a very important case, and holding a magazine in his hands, asked if he could take it. The waitress stood confused and, of course, allowed him to take the catalog, only she wanted to talk about money, as the stranger poured a handful of gold coins into her hands. She stood with them and shouted in their wake that it was too much, for the paper cost only 5 silver pieces, but the traveler was already gone. The man, mounted on his horse, said in a low voice that it was time for him to go back. It was the first missing prince, Regan Klaus Owen. Louise lay on the bed and read the latest news. The catalog wrote about public opinion. The number of citizens who supported the empress's divorce was growing rapidly. The Empress had tilted public opinion to her side by spitting on her own dignity and personally placing an advertisement. Many literary critics saw her actions as a satirical expression of the pain of unrequited. The maids surrounded the girl and cheerfully said that the citizens of the empire were on her side. The maid with the blonde hair looked admiringly at her mistress and confessed that at first she had been worried about her. But as she now saw, the girl had foreseen everything in advance. Louise lay listening to their eulogies, but in truth she had provided for nothing. The advantage was now in the hands of the Empress. The people criticized the Emperor and demanded her release. The protagonist was glad, because with all this, she could get a divorce within a month. But still the assistant worriedly asked the Empress whether she thinks about work after the divorce. The girl replied that of course she thinks, because she has to provide for herself somehow. But the maid said that she was the daughter of Duke Videl, and the girl was right, because it was better to live as a lady of the House of Videl than as an empress with eternal restrictions. The Videl family was rich, but the girl had to think about what to do with the rest of the family. And the situation was also complicated by the fact that Louise had no idea where her family was. Rhonda burst into the chambers again, shouting that they had a problem because Lord Louis had arrived in the capital. The protagonist raised herself on her elbows in surprise and asked who it was. The assistant, panting and excitedly replied that it was as she did not know who it was, for it was Louis Waddell, her elder brother. Louis Waddell was Louise's first and only brother, and the heir to the Waddell family. The Waddells rarely left their estate, only if it was about something important, and the girl also remembered from the book that they had come to the capital only once when Louisa died. It was the day of the emperor's coronation. All the nobles were supposed to be present then. And even then they did not come to Louise. The protagonist wondered why her brother had come so suddenly and thought that maybe the story would somehow change because of her, as it had happened to Ruel. Louise asked her assistants what kind of man her brother was. They all stared at her in surprise. The girl hurriedly excused herself. She said that they just hadn't seen each other for a long time and that's why she didn't remember him well. The girls cried, for their mistress had not seen her brother for 10 years, and they were sad about it. A servant girl with blonde hair said in simple words that Louisa's brother was out of his mind. She recounted the most famous incident why, which took place at the emperor's coronation. That day, the empress decided to return to her chambers early, so she did not catch it. In fact, the girl had returned to her own because of the people who had shushed her, thus showing their disrespect for her. It was then that an argument took place between Lord Louis and Lord Emio. Louis was furious, so Lord Emio's hair, Louise asked impatiently what he had done, had torn it out, but the maids replied that he had burned it, or rather half of it. The protagonist was shocked. Emio pounced on her brother, demanding reparations, but so in his 18 years Lord Emio went bald. He went to famous doctors, but alas, all was to no avail. After that, even the chancellor had dubbed him a madman. Another maid with blonde hair reassured her mistress that he was just a little special, but the girl understood. Louise hoped her brother would turn out to be someone she could have a normal conversation with. The same blonde maid remembered that Louis had also burned down the crown prince's garden. The protagonist couldn't contain her outrage and asked why he was burning everything down. The maid explained that it was all because the Vidells only choose fire elements, hence their temperament. But the girl wasn't allowed to finish her sentence by the maid with blonde hair. She just covered her mouth. When Louise heard that, she asked them if she could control fire too. The assistant replied that she probably was, since she was a Videl too. While the girl was getting used to this world, she read a lot of literature about elements. There were different kinds of elemental crystals, and it was up to the user to choose them. The Videl family had chosen a fire elemental for generations. People being blessed by elementals was very rare on the continent, so they received special treatment in all corners of the continent. If the protagonist succeeds, she won't have to humiliate herself in front of the Videllas. If they don't help her, she'll just ask for refuge in the other side. So the girl decided to delay the victory over her brother for now. Another servant girl came running to the Empress with the news that her brother was already here. Louise said she had heard the news already, and asked if her brother had already arrived in the capital, but the maid replied that Louis was already waiting for her outside. The man was standing near the gate, waiting for his sister. He was already displeased that she was taking so long to swarm in. The maid standing next to him apologized and said that the Empress hadn't seen her family in a long time, so she wanted to look good in front of him. Louis grudgingly asked what other family. The assistant didn't understand him. Then the man explained that she wasn't his sister. Rhonda met the pink-haired man and led him to the meeting place. When she arrived at the gazebo in the garden, the aide announced her brother. Louis didn't like the flowers from the doorstep and wanted to burn them, but Louise drew his attention. The man looked at her in surprise and did not recognize her, thinking who this girl was. He called her a fairy. All the girls who were in the garden looked at him in shock. Louis sat down opposite the girl and stared at her intently. Louise already thought that he would burn a hole in her. He frowned at her. The protagonist kept thinking that how she should address him, brother, or observe the formalities, that is, to call Lord Louis. The man finally spoke first, bowed his head a little, said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Louis addressed her formally, so the girl knew exactly what to call him, Lord. She smiled at him and told him she was glad to meet him. The man apologized for daring to pay an uninvited visit and thanked her for making time for him. The Empress calmed him down, saying that she had not much to do today, and moreover they were family, and asked him to be at home here. Louis, at her words about family, said that he was only a descendant of a noble family, and how dare he feel at home near her. He jumped up and blurted out that he didn't have much time, so he would get straight to the point. Opening the journal on the table, he explained that he had arrived because of this, and asked if what was written there was true. The girl replied that she did. Louis then sat down and asked her what she was up to, and told her that if it was all for the Emperor's favor, she had better stop now, for she was dishonoring the Videl name. The man said openly that he didn't care about her and the Emperor's squabbles, but he asked that his family's name not be tarnished. Louise asked what made him think it was all for the Emperor's favor. The man replied that it was because she wasn't going to divorce him anyway. The protagonist replied that she didn't care about the opinions of outsiders, but she really hoped that at least her family would believe in her sincerity. The girl thought sadly that if Louisa had such a family, the pink-haired girl was literally isolating herself, working for everyone. Louis started his shtick about how they weren't family and he didn't have a sister. The protagonist averted her eyes frustratedly. The man continued. That first she had turned her back on the Waddells, and now she was making such a fuss about the divorce. He didn't understand what she was up to, but he had already promised he wouldn't fall for her tricks. Louise didn't understand what her brother meant. Louis explained that the girl had chosen the Emperor and his family. The protagonist was angry because of his words, after all. She was forced to choose the Emperor. And in general, in the family of the Empire, she was the third extra. In her own family, she considered a traitor. The girl became more and more convinced that there was nonsense going on around. The pink-haired man stood up from the table and said that was all he had to say, and asked her to remember his words, warning her not to think of returning to the Videl house, for Louise was now a member of the family, and to all Videls she was considered an enemy. The girl looked at him glumly. The man turned around and walked toward the exit. Louise stared at his back and thought that she wanted to punch him so badly, but on the other hand, she had the feeling that if she let him walk away like that, she would never find out. She clenched her fists and ran after him, yelling at him to stand. She tripped over a rock and flew into him from behind, wrapping her arms around him, calling him brother. The pink-haired man was shocked. The girl stood and awkwardly hugged her brother from behind, wondering why she had stumbled at just such a moment. The man stood there and didn't move. But then he pulled back a little from his stupor and asked her what she had just said and what she had called him. He began to tremble. Louise was worried that maybe he was angry with her because she called him brother, but still at his request, stammering a little, she repeated what she had called him again. Louis burst into flames. The girl was shocked and started yelling that he was on fire, asking him if he was okay because the flames were hot. The man broke free of her grip and screamed at her not to touch him. He turned to her a little flushed. Louise was surprised to see him. The man was reacting in such a way to his sister lumping him in with her brother. The protagonist realized it and started running around calling him brother. Louis stood covering his face with his hand. He was embarrassed. He pulled himself together and said that it didn't make any difference. But his sister grabbed his arm and asked him why he was so cold to her, since they hadn't seen each other in 10 years. Louis pulled out of her arms and asked her not to say that because she was the first one to turn away from them. Louise didn't understand what he was telling her. The pink-haired man explained that she had never once tried to contact them, so she had better not play happy family. The protagonist didn't understand how it was that she never tried to contact them. The brother grinned evilly and said that he always wrote to her, how she was doing, how her health was, and so on. He had sent her must be 1,000 letters in 10 years, but the sister had never answered a single one, even when the man begged her to write back at least a line. The girl flapped her eyelashes in surprise. Louis looked at her with resentment and said it was too late to fix anything. The man turned around and walked towards the exit. Louise stood and was shocked that the heroine was the first to sever ties with her family, and wondered why she had done that. The girl sat in the room eating sweets while talking to her assistants. The girls stood excitedly looking at the Empress. The main character couldn't believe that Louise was the first to break off her relationship with her family. The girl wasn't Louise, so she can't understand why she would do such a thing. But what she knew for sure was that Louise longed for her family for the rest of her life. So something didn't add up here. The girl covered her eyes in incomprehension and said aloud that it was all driving her crazy. Rule leaned close to her and said that he was starting to lose his mind too. The man's whole appearance said he hadn't slept in days. He looked tired and had bruises under his eyes. He exuded a heavy aura. Louise giggled and hastily apologized, saying that her head was already spinning. Rule, gathering his papers into a pile and banging them irritably on the table, replied that he wasn't surprised at that, and given the crazy things she was doing, it was only natural that she'd get dizzy, and since she'd offered to help him, he asked her to focus. The protagonist, holding a quill in her hands, looked at him expressively. Louise had offered to help him out of pity when he passed by with a pile of papers, exhausted and worn out, but she hadn't thought he would agree. They had a lot of work to do, and the table was full of stacks of papers. Louise exhaled tiredly. This didn't escape Ruel's attention, and he angrily asked what was the matter. The protagonist wanted to ask about her brother. The Chancellor heard that he palace yesterday and asked what they were doing because Louis almost set fire to his office. Louise noted worriedly that Rule had just called her brother by his first name and asked if they were close, and generally assumed they were lovers. The Chancellor blushed and blurted out why she had drawn that conclusion. The protagonist explained to him that he wasn't interested in women, so she decided so, and assured him that he could always share with her. She definitely wouldn't tell anyone. The man still shouted that they went to the academy together. He was top of the class in the general science department, and Louis was top of the class among the knights. Louise was surprised that her brother had graduated as a knight. Rule said that Videl's children were good with the sword, and if she hadn't married, she would have graduated from the academy too, and since she was good at administration, she could join his faculty. The protagonist replied that she was glad to hear praise from him. The Chancellor responded that praise could make even a whale dance, so he asked her to finally focus on her work. Rule began to write something angrily, and the girl looked at him interestedly. His curiosity got the better of him, and he asked what Louis had done yesterday. Louise smiled at him and told him that they had parted on a not very good note. The brother had asked his sister why answering him 10. Even the Chancellor was surprised and asked her how she could do such a thing. But then, the Empress's 2 assistants could not stand it any longer. They shouted that it wasn't true because the girl had been sending letters to her family since she was a child. The blonde confirmed Ron's words by saying that Louise sent letters to Lord Louis and Duke Waddell 3 times a week. The protagonist stared at them in surprise and thought in her head that apparently Louise really hadn't turned her back on her family. Rhonda shouted indignantly that it was the girl's family who had never once deigned to answer her, and they acted as if Louise didn't exist. The girl thought quickly that if both parties were writing to each other but not receiving letters, then it would appear, she voiced her thought aloud, that someone was intercepting the letters. Ruel agreed. Because there were no other explanations anymore. It was obvious that someone was trying to completely tear the girl away from her family. Louise asked who could have intercepted the Empress's letters at the palace. The Chancellor replied that not many. The pink-haired girl began to enumerate. First, it was definitely not the Emperor. The man agreed with her. In her mind, the girl thought it was because he was too stupid. And secondly, it was definitely not Lyra, because the letters had started disappearing 10 years ago, and she had only appeared in the palace 5 years ago. Ruel tapped his fingers nervously on the table, agreeing with the Empress, because the Earl's daughter would never do such a thing unless she was completely out of her mind. Louise rose from the table and, leaning her hands on the table, began to tell them what they should do. She raised her finger importantly and announced that she would be setting the traps from now on. As Louis sat in the inn looking out the window, a servant came up to him and announced that his master had a visitor. The man asked in surprise that someone knew he was here. The butler excitedly replied that it was the Empress who had sent a man. The pink-haired man froze at this news and asked excitedly where the man was. The servant, stammering, replied that he was waiting for him in the drawing room. When Louis came to the room where his visitor was waiting, he grimaced at the sight of the man. It was Ruel, and he awkwardly raised his hand in greeting and stammered a little, saying that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The pink-haired man asked the Chancellor why he was here. Ruel replied irritably that he didn't know what he was doing here. Then the man turned around and told him to get out. Ruel jumped up sharply, stopping him quickly before the man was completely out the door, said that someone had been stealing letters from the Flower Palace for a long time. At such news, Louis turned to his guest in surprise. Ruel said that was why he hadn't received a letter from the Empress in 10 years. The pink-haired man looked at the Chancellor in surprise and hope. Ruel looked at him worriedly and thought that anyone could tell that the man loved his sister. Louis Vidal, heir to House Vidal, was the Empire's foremost troublemaker, bully, and bully. A cold-hearted knight, and his fiery abilities were completely at odds with him. But there was a time when he still had a hot heart. The guy was very happy when his sister was born. It only lasted 7 years. When he got a letter from the Duke that the imperial family had taken Louise, he dropped everything and ran to pack his things to return home. Ruel in the room asked him in surprise that he was serious about quitting the academy and called him crazy. But Louis didn't answer anything, only looked at him sadly. At the time, Ruel had judged his friend because he didn't know the whole picture. Now the Chancellor tried to reason with the Empress's brother, saying that the girl was making every effort to deal with the whole situation that had formed over these 10 years. He urged him that he could not hate her, and therefore asked him to stop acting like a little child. But then, the table suddenly caught fire. The man stared fearfully and shouted that the table was on fire, and the butler began to quickly put out the fire. The Chancellor yelled at him that in the future, his wife must own the element of water because every quarrel they had, he would burn down their house. In the background, a servant mourned over a charred mahogany table. But Louis didn't understand the seriousness of his actions and simply said that he would buy a new one then. Ruel shouted angrily that he was crazy. Louis sat down in a chair, saying that it wasn't his place to worry about his marriage and allowed him to continue on with his story. Ruel also sat down at the table and continued that when they had narrowed down the suspects, there was only one left. But it was only their guesses, and they weren't going to reveal their suspicions until they were sure. Louis replied that it was all marvelous and asked what he was going to do, since he definitely had a plan. Ruel replied that of course there was, and the Empress was already on her way to the main suspect. The pink-haired man looked at him in surprise. He trembled and clenched his hand into a fist with anger, asking the Chancellor that he really sent this fragile child alone to an unknown place. Ruel waved his hand excitedly, calming Louis down, and said that this child, or rather the Empress, was far from being called fragile. He said that his brother couldn't even imagine what the Empress was really like, just a devil in the flesh. But then a fire formed behind him again. This time a man's chair was burning. Ruel shouted fearfully. The butler immediately put out the water. The Chancellor was soaking wet, water dripping from him. He was quiet, recovering from his fright. The butler mourned the now burned chair. While Ruel sat silent, coming to his senses, Louis stood from the table and walked over to the man, grabbing him by the chest and ordering him to take him there quickly. Rule stared at him fearfully and stammered, not understanding where he wanted him to take him. The pink-haired man asked angrily that he was stupid and ordered him to take him to his sister. At the palace, Rhonda stopped the messenger and handed him the letter, saying that the Empress had asked for the letter to be given to Duke Videl as a matter of urgency, so she brought it as fast as she could. The man accepted the letter with the words that everything was fine, got on his horse and rode off to fulfill the order. The assistant stood and escorted him with a look. There was someone lurking in the bushes at this time. The man arrived at the place. The woman to whom he handed the letter asked him if it was another letter for the Duke. The messenger confirmed and said that the Empress had said it was urgent. Perhaps there was something important there. The woman was indignant and said she hadn't had enough yet. Was she that stubborn or just plain stupid? But the man asked the woman to speak up more carefully because he had heard that Lord Louis Waddell was in the capital. The vile woman grinned evilly, saying that how could this dumbass catch them? But the messenger didn't stop. He excitedly said that the Empress had changed lately and he thought they should have stopped. The woman turned to Sir Rami, asking him that he was trying to give a backhand because of this, and asked him not to worry because even if they were caught, whoever was doing this was on their side, and the Empress wouldn't be able to do anything. But she didn't finish because suddenly she was interrupted by Louise. The girl asked who she was talking about. The messenger jumped up startled and turned around to her. Louise asked them if it wasn't clear to them that everything had changed since she had arrived. The man started twisting his arms excitedly and trying to say something. The woman, who was sure they would not be caught, began to say that there had been a misunderstanding. Louise grinned evilly at the maid's nonchalance and told her that she dared to say it was a misunderstanding, even when she had literally caught them by the hand. The bellboy tried to justify himself somehow, but it didn't work well. The servant girl looked at the Empress strangely. The girl caught her gaze and grudgingly remarked that ordinary servants had no right to look at her like that. The insolent woman told the Empress that this was the Empress Mother's palace, so she might not be here right now, but that didn't give Louise the right to barge in here uninvited. The Empress pointed her finger at her and said that this woman thought that mere servants and knights had rights to steal the Empress's letters. The maid wanted to say something, but Louise demanded the letter from her while she asked nicely. But the woman replied that she couldn't because it was a direct order from the Mother Empress. Then the girl said that it really turned out to be true. Then the Empress had ordered them to commit the theft. Then the maid became furious and began to shout that how dare the Empress use such language toward the Empress's mother, and the fact that they had wanted to intercept her letters to the family a moment ago did not embarrass her in the slightest. Louise twisted her finger at her temple, saying that she herself had just said that the Empress had given them the order. And the girl wondered if the Emperor knew all about it. Just then, the maid sat down. The protagonist turned away from them, saying that if she didn't, she clearly right now should have gone and told him about their shenanigans. The girl knew that the Emperor had nothing to do with it. It turned out that the Mother Empress alone did it all. But still, Louise didn't understand why. After all, it would have made more sense, on the contrary, to use her to gain favor with her family. Why was it necessary to muddy the waters like that? Louise turned and called out to Sir Rami. The man jumped up and ran towards the girl. The heroine said that she was giving him one last chance. He was to bring her the letter. The messenger replied curtly that it would be done, quickly snatched the letter from the hands of the ugly maid and ran to the lady. The woman was left standing with nothing, calling out to Sir Rami. The man turned to her and said that he was telling her that it was all wrong. He turned back to Her Majesty saying that he was just following orders. He had no choice. Louise, holding the letter in her hand, replied to him that she had already promised to give him one last chance, so he had nothing to worry about. But in return, she asked him to return all the letters they had stolen over these 10 years, for they were supposed to be in this palace. The man agreed with her that they must be somewhere exactly in the palace. He bowed to her and ran to carry out the order. As he ran past the maid, she called out to him menacingly, but the man paid no attention to her. She shouted after him that when the Emperor's mother found out, she would snap his head off. A guard of knights arrived at Louise's side and bowed to her, greeting her. With them were also maids. The girl turned to them, saying that they had arrived at her just in time. She pointed her finger at the servant girl and ordered her to be locked up immediately. The men were shocked, but ran to carry out the order. The woman shouted at her to think about what she was doing. After all, she was a personal servant of the Mother Empress, and if she found out what Louise had done to her. But she didn't finish as the woman was grabbed under the arms. The Empress smiled at her, telling her not to worry about it because they would handle the whole situation themselves. The maid was surprised to notice that the girl was not afraid of the Mother Empress. Louise looked at her incomprehensibly and asked if she looked scared, because if she was scared, she wouldn't have started all this. The maid, as she passed the Empress, smiled maliciously, saying that the girl must have wanted to visit that room again. She gloated, saying whether she would be all right then. Louise, walking down the hallway, thought about the maid's behavior. Why she had this behavior and what kind of room it was, and most of all, she wondered why Louise tolerated being treated like this. She speculated that it could be because the girl was an introvert or she just didn't know something. Rhonda asked what was wrong. Louise worriedly replied that everything was fine. The protagonist said that it was time for them to move back anyway, because she was getting hungry from all the events. The assistant replied that it was long past time for tea and asked her to hurry up. The main character arrived at the flower garden, but there were guests waiting for her. It was a cunning fox, Lady Lyra Blair. The girl already realized that today she will not be able to rest. Lyra bowed to the Empress and apologized for arriving at her unannounced. Louise sat down at the table and replied that if she was sorry, she should let her warn her next time, and asked what had brought the girl to her. She asked her to be brief, because she was tired. Her husband's mistress worriedly said that she only wanted to apologize for what had happened. She apologized once again for her disrespectful behavior. It was because she had not been informed that the Emperor had summoned her to his house. It turns out that mistresses must also be warned in advance when the Emperor summons his lawful wife. Louise replied that the girl was just worried about the Emperor. She understood. Lyra Blair looked at her in surprise. The Empress smiled at her and asked her if she was done, because it would be better for her to leave before they brought her tea. But the girl didn't want to leave for nothing and started apologizing to the main character again. Louise raised her hands, saying she accepted her apology and forgave her, and asked now could she leave her alone, or did Lyra have anything to add? Her mistress fiddled nervously with her fingers and awkwardly began that could she ask what they had talked about with Yuri, more specifically what with the Emperor they had discussed then. The Empress replied that Lyra could have asked the Emperor about it herself, but it seemed that Yuri was in no hurry to tell his mistress all the news. But Lyra got angry and shouted that Yuri always told her everything, and began to justify that now the Emperor was busy so she did not want to bother him. Louise gave in to the insolent girl and told her that he wanted to talk to her about her request for a divorce. The Empress had asked him again about it, but he had refused her. Lyra stared dumbfounded at the girl. She didn't think the Emperor would deny his wife this, and stammered and asked why. The protagonist replied that she did not know what was going on in his head. She herself wished it were a lie. Then Lyra, shivering, asked what the Empress was going to do. Louise didn't understand why her husband's mistress was wondering what she was going to do. Was there anything she could do here? Though the girl remembered that her husband's mistress didn't know what she had been doing lately, or rather, looking for an obedient and devoted lover. Louise wondered why she acted like that. Because she didn't care or because the Emperor cared about her so much. But in any case, the girl came to the conclusion that it didn't concern her. Lyra blurted out stupidly to Louise that she knew she was the reason she and the Emperor were estranged. The Empress said sarcastically that it was amazing how the girl realized it so quickly, because she thought it would take her at least 10 years, and clapped her hands. The mistress knelt sharply and suddenly before Louise and seized her hands, saying that she wished they could be friends. She stared at her with her pleading eyes and begged her to become a sister, for she was sure they could be. She promised even to serve her. Louise frowned in surprise and asked her to repeat everything she had just told her. Lyra said that the girl had an older brother. She had also heard that they were separated at a young age when she became crown princess. Her mistress admitted that she had younger siblings too, so she was sure they could get along. Louise took her hands from Lyra's grip and said that she was now saying the same thing as the emperor. Her mistress cheerfully replied that it was because she was always trying to understand him. The mistress embarrassedly confessed that she was satisfied with her position as the emperor's concubine and promised that she would never encroach on her place, and said that poor Yuri was having a hard time, so the girl had the nerve to ask the emperor to stop torturing him. Louise interrupted her ramblings by saying that reality was not a fairy tale and a happy ending always meant sacrifice, and that she and the emperor had inadvertently demanded sacrifices from her and then said she had rejected their goodwill. Lyra replied that the empress was too harsh. At such an accusation, the girl grinned and said that she was saying this to one who was having a perfectly rational conversation with her husband's mistress. At Louise calling the girl her mistress, Lyra took offense and accused the empress of cruelty, because, in her stupid opinion, everything would have been fine if Louise had initially compromised. Louise responded to this by telling her that first they were trying to take everything away from her, and now they were telling her something about compromise. Didn't Lyra think that was selfish? The girl remained silent. The protagonist thought why she was even arguing with her and called her over, reminded her that this seemed to be her first visit to the Rose Palace, and asked her what her first impressions were. Lyra blushed a little, and examining the garden said that she thought it was a marvelous place, because it was so spacious, luxurious, and grand that it was not in comparison with other palaces. Then the empress asked if the girl would like to live here. Lyra looked at her excitedly. Louise smiled at her, and once again told her that she didn't want to be the lady of the flower palace. The girl wondered why it hadn't occurred to her before, because she would never be able to persuade the stupid emperor in her life, as long as it was in his interest to keep Louise in the palace, so he would never divorce her. But with Lyra, it was different. But the girl did not believe her and asked her that she was saying this on purpose, for if she now agreed, the empress would go at once and tell Yuri about it, that she was aiming at the place of empress. Louise, covering her face with her hand, at these accusations said, "God forbid." Lyra was sure she was not stupid. Then the protagonist realized that she would not be able to change her mind. The girl told her mistress that earlier she had said she was fine with being the emperor's concubine, but what would happen if she got pregnant? Lyra looked at her in surprise. Louise went on to say that her child would not inherit the throne, and would she be okay with that? Lyra asked the empress why she would say such a thing. Louise answered her, "That's because Lyra is not an empress, and the protagonist's child, even if he was younger, could get the throne anyway, while her child would be forced to be in the shadows for the rest of his life." Lyra was silent, thinking about something. The protagonist continued to press that she says she is satisfied with the place of the concubine of the emperor, but then her children will be all their lives in oppression. They will not be allowed to even raise their eyes, and even less to stand in the way. Perhaps Lyra herself can live all her life like this. But the empress asked her if she is ready to subject her children to such a fate. And now Louise revealed to Lyra that things were not as rosy as perhaps she had imagined, and asked her not to pretend to be a nice sheep, because ambitious people are better than hypocrites. The mistress asked the girl why she was telling her all these cruel words. Didn't she care about other people's suffering? The protagonist asked her not to be sassed because she was the only one still continuing to act so arrogant and all-powerful, even though she was only a lover. She asked her why the girl always had such an attitude. Didn't she care about other people's suffering? Lyra jumped up from her knees, and out of the whole speech of the empress, she was offended only by the words that she was a mistress, so she shouted that she was not a mistress. She did not consider herself a mistress because Yuri promised her that he would marry her soon, and then she would not be a mistress but would officially become his wife. Louise agreed with her and said that she would call her wife only after the wedding, but until then she was still a mistress to her. Stupid Lyra kept saying that Louise was very cruel and started shedding tears, drooling that she came to her because she wanted to be friends. But how could the empress say such words to poor and unfortunate sheep Lyra? She's a god dandelion. She didn't do anything. Even the maid stood in shock as she started to cry. From the side ran another stupid specimen, Yuri to be exact. He called out to Louise and asked her what she had done. The man ran up to Lyra. She started asking him what brought him here, He turned the poor sheep around and asked her what happened and if the Empress had hurt her. He ordered her to stop crying and answer him. In the background, Louise watched this circus indifferently. Louise, with tears in her eyes, assured Yuri that Her Majesty hadn't done anything. She started whimpering and gave him the impression that she wasn't good enough. The protagonist looked at them and grinned, thinking that Lyra was a great actress. The mistress started crying into the Emperor's shoulder. The man asked what she was talking about, and who told her that. He turned to Louise and asked her what she had said that made her shiver. The protagonist hummed and replied that she didn't know and maybe she was cold because the sun was already setting. The Emperor began to reprimand the Empress for how she could be so shameless when, out of some misunderstanding, she should be full of remorse. And the underdog asked that she had called Lyra specifically to sling mud. Louise examined her nails, answering him that Lyra had come to her on her own. The man could not settle down and, pointing his finger at her, grinned evilly, saying that she had finally decided to show her true face because she had asked for a divorce to get rid of her, and he announced that he had known it all along. Gosh, it never occurs to anyone that a girl wants to get rid of such a stupid society and live in peace by herself. The girl wanted to punch him, but she saw someone walking towards them and fell sharply from her chair to the floor. Lyra and Yuri looked at her in surprise. The man assumed she had finally decided to apologize and asked her to be nicer. Louise coldly told him to cut the crap. As they stared at her in surprise, the protagonist suddenly started crying.